The Romans were true masters of survival, especially when it came to feeding an empire. Rain, heat, snow, pirates, didn't matter. They always found a way to get food where it needed to go. But how did they do it? And most importantly, could we learn a thing or two from their ancient food system? First, I want to give you a little backstory on how insane their logistics game really was. The Romans impressively built over 85,000 kilometers, that's 53,000 miles, of stone-paved highways stretched across their world, enough to circle the earth twice. These roads connected everything from rainy Scotland to sun-soaked North Africa, and from Western Europe all the way to Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq. But these roads weren't just for travel. They were lifelines for food, materials, and military supplies. Roman commanders could even accurately calculate how long it would take to move their armies, a level of precision that sounds almost modern. How accurate, you ask? Cologne to Rome? 67 days. Rome to Brindisi? 57 days. Rome to Syria, including 2 days at sea? 124 days flat. With such precise planning, Roman armies never had to worry about running out of food. Well, almost never. While roads were great, some goods were just too heavy or too bulky to transport over land. That's where ships came in. Huge riverboats and cargo ships, often owned by private ship owners, called naviculari, carried wine, olive oil, timber, marble, firewood, and grain across the empire. And the Romans weren't just about letting everyone do their own thing. They organized ship owners into leagues, collegia naviculari, early trade unions, to ensure that food and supplies reached the empire's key cities and military bases on time and efficiently. During Emperor Hadrian's reign, a new power player started making waves, literally. The collegia of naviculari, or leagues of shipowners, became prominent during his reign. At first, these shipowners operated independently, but by the 3rd century, they were drawn under the control of the imperial service. One of the biggest and most important fleets, the Alexandrian grain fleet. These ships were the heavy lifters, hauling tons of wheat from Egypt all the way to Rome to keep the city fed. And these weren't just little fishing boats either. Greek philosopher Lucian once wrote about a ship so huge, between 1,200 and 1,300 tons. It got caught in a storm and drifted around for 70 days before finally making it to port in Piraeus. That's like getting stuck in traffic for over 2 months. But even these massive ships had their limits. When winter rolled in, the seas turned rough, and grain shipments came to a full stop. No sailing, no supplies, just the Romans waiting for the weather to clear. The Mediterranean was so central to Roman life, they didn't just name it, they claimed it, calling it Mare Nostrum, or Our Sea. But here's the twist. For all their sailing smarts, Rome itself wasn't exactly port-friendly. The city sat nearly 20 miles inland, not exactly ideal for shipping. This geographic headache lasted for centuries, but the Romans, they didn't let it slow them down. As their empire stretched farther and wider, so did their appetite for grain, goods, and resources from every corner of the Mediterranean. Conquest was only half the game. Keeping everything running smoothly was the real challenge. By the end of the 1st century BC, Rome had ballooned into a sprawling metropolis with over 1 million residents. But there was one massive problem. How do you feed a city that size without a nearby maritime port? But before I tell you more about that, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the video. So, Rome's borders stretched across the Mediterranean, and goods poured in from every direction. Olive oil, wine, garum, a fermented fish sauce that Romans were obsessed with. Slaves and construction materials arrived from Spain, Gaul, North Africa, and the Near East. But the real lifeline of the empire, grain. The emperor's most crucial responsibility wasn't leading armies or expanding borders. It was making sure that grain flowed into the city without interruption. Romans practically lived on wheat, either in bread or as a thick porridge, and each adult consumed an estimated 400 to 600 pounds of it per year. Multiply that by over 1 million people, and Rome needed a jaw-dropping 650 million pounds of grain annually just to keep everyone from going hungry. But getting that grain to Rome wasn't always easy. Storms, shipwrecks, and unpredictable weather constantly disrupted supply lines. When grain ships were lost at sea, the consequences were immediate. Shortages, panic, and eventually, riots. Romans took their food supply very seriously, and any delay could send the city into chaos. Imagine an entire empire held together by a steady supply of bread, and without it, even the mighty Rome risked falling apart. Can you picture the pressure on the emperor to keep that supply chain running? The Roman government knew one simple truth: a hungry population was a dangerous one. From the 2nd century BC onward, they took control of the grain supply, regulating prices and making sure food was always within reach for the masses. By the time of Augustus, the emperor himself was distributing massive amounts of grain of up to £500 per person to 250,000 households. Why? Because keeping Rome's people fed meant keeping Rome itself stable. By the 1st century AD, Italian farms simply couldn't keep up with the growing appetite. Rome turned to its newest conquests, especially the fertile lands of North Africa and Egypt. These provinces became the empire's breadbasket, producing the grain that fueled the capital. The scale of this operation was staggering. Thousands of ships constantly crisscrossed the Mediterranean, hauling over 100 tons of grain at a time. Sea transport was the lifeline of the empire, not just because of the massive quantities involved, but because it was at least 40 times cheaper than moving goods by land. But you see, the Romans had a serious problem when it came to transporting goods by sea: pirates. These ruthless raiders were always on the lookout, ready to seize ships and steal valuable cargo. Think about the frustration of Roman merchants sending off their precious grain, wine, and oil, only for it to fall into the hands of merciless sea bandits. It was downright sickening. During the 4th and 3rd centuries BC, Etruscan pirates terrorized Greek merchants, making trade routes dangerous, especially near the island of Rhodes. Rhodes, a thriving trade hub, relied heavily on shipping through the Adriatic Sea and took matters into its own hands, deploying a powerful navy to keep the sea lanes safe. But when Rhodian naval power collapsed in 167 BC, piracy surged again. By the 2nd century BC, a new menace emerged: the notorious Cilician pirates of modern-day Turkey. These seafaring marauders became a nightmare for Rome, targeting grain ships, capturing crews, and selling them into slavery. And if they found important or wealthy passengers on board, they held them hostage, demanding massive ransoms. With Rome's growing reliance on overseas grain supplies, these pirates were a direct threat to the stability of the empire. But how would Rome fight back against these lawless raiders of the sea? You see, the Romans had long tolerated the menace of Cilician pirates. After all, their economy thrived on a steady influx of cheap slave labor, and these pirates were a reliable, if unofficial, supplier. But their patience ran out in 75 BC when the pirates made a grave mistake. They kidnapped a young, ambitious nobleman named Emperor Julius Caesar. Dragged to the island of Farmakonisi, Caesar found himself held for ransom. Most captives would have despaired, but not him. According to the historian Plutarch, Caesar treated his captivity more like an extended vacation than a life-threatening ordeal. He joked with his captors, participated in their games, and even read his speeches aloud to them, demanding their feedback. When the pirates set his ransom at 20 talents of silver, he scoffed at the figure, insulted that they valued him so cheaply, and insisted they raise it to 50 talents instead. The pirates, amused by his confidence, indulged his bravado, unaware they were sealing their own fate. Caesar often told them, laughingly, that once he was free, he would return and have them all crucified. They thought he was joking. Let me tell you, he wasn't. The moment his ransom was paid and he was released, Caesar wasted no time. He raised a fleet, hunted the pirates down, and captured them. True to his word, he had them all crucified, though, in a rare display of mercy, he ordered their throats slit first to spare them the agony of a slow death. It was a bold move, one that foreshadowed the ruthless ambition that would one day make him the most powerful man in Rome. But it also raised a question. If pirates could so easily disrupt Rome's food supply and kidnap its elites, How long could the empire afford to ignore them? By 67 BC, Rome had finally had enough of the pirate menace. The last straw came when these sea bandits brazenly attacked Ostia, Rome's key port. That was the moment the Romans decided to take piracy seriously. But how do you fight an enemy that vanishes into the waves? The answer was Pompey the Great, a commander of the Roman military, one to be feared greatly. With an unprecedented level of power and resources at his disposal, Pompey was tasked with eliminating piracy once and for all. And it wasn't just about Rome's honor, it was about survival. The grain supply and other essential food resources had to keep flowing, or the city would descend into chaos. Plutarch the historian describes the situation in dramatic detail, noting that the pirates were a full-blown terror. These sea raiders threw lavish feasts on the shores, played music as they plundered, and didn't just steal goods, they kidnapped high-ranking officials and even held entire cities for ransom. Their fleet, over 1,000 ships strong. Their conquests, more than 400 cities under their control. This wasn't some ragtag group of criminals. It was an organized empire of chaos. Pompey wasn't playing around when it came to pirates. With thousands of war-hardened troops at his command, he launched a relentless campaign against pirate strongholds across the Mediterranean. The result? A massacre for those who resisted, but for those who surrendered. An unexpected twist. Instead of executing them all, Pompey offered pardons and resettled them inland, far from the tempting call of the sea. The logic was simple. Give them land, a fresh start, and a reason to abandon piracy. And guess what? It worked. This mix of brute force and diplomacy became the most effective anti-piracy strategy of the Roman era. By the time Emperor Augustus took his last breath in AD 14, Rome had locked down virtually the entire Mediterranean coastline. Pirates had nowhere left to hide. With the Mediterranean now fully under Roman control, something remarkable happened. Pax Romana. This era of peace didn't just keep pirates at bay, it made the dangerous, cutthroat life at sea far less appealing. Why risk your neck on pirate raids when farming and trade could actually make you rich? The unity of the empire also meant that cities and provinces worked together to stamp out any lingering pirate threats. Rome had done what no civilization before it had managed, transforming the Mediterranean from a lawless battleground into a superhighway of trade, security, and prosperity. But the big question is, was this truly the end of piracy? Or was it just lurking in the shadows, waiting for Rome's grip to loosen? Now, the Romans may have been masters of military strategy and engineering, but even they couldn't completely rid the Mediterranean of pirates. Despite their best efforts, piracy remained a persistent thorn in their side, rearing its head whenever Rome's grip loosened. But how did the empire attempt to stamp out this menace, and why did it keep coming back? When piracy flared up, Rome didn't hesitate to launch large-scale naval campaigns. These weren't just a few ships chasing bandits on the high seas. These were full-on military operations aimed at wiping out pirate strongholds, burning fleets, and ensuring safe passage for trade. One such campaign took place during the reign of Emperor Tiberius in the 1st century AD. The citizens of Ilion, modern-day Turkey, were so grateful for the efforts of Roman general Titus Valerius Proculus that they honored him with an inscription, thanking him for destroying the pirate groups in the Hellespont and for guarding the city in all ways without burdening it. Clearly, Rome's naval forces could still pack a punch when needed. But while Rome at its height managed to keep the seas relatively safe, this fragile peace didn't last forever. As the empire's power declined, piracy surged once more. By late antiquity, Roman authority over the Mediterranean was slipping, and where order crumbled, chaos followed. The once dominant Roman fleet could do little to stop the resurgence of seafaring marauders. Even the powerful Byzantines, who inherited much of Rome's naval strength, struggled to contain them. So, what finally put an end to this pirate plague? It wasn't until the rise of formidable Arab and European navies in the early medieval period that piracy in the Mediterranean was truly brought under control. It seems that as long as there were riches to be stolen and weak defenses to exploit, the lure of piracy never truly disappeared. If you had lived in those times, would you have braved the seas, or would the fear of pirate attacks have kept you firmly on land? However, The Romans were master planners who knew that relying solely on imported food wasn't always the smartest move. So, what did they do? They grew their own food, of course, but not just in any old way. They used engineering genius to make sure their farms thrived no matter the conditions. They built aqueducts, canals, and irrigation systems to keep their crops watered. Even in the driest regions, water would flow across vast distances, bringing life to fields that would have otherwise been barren. Aqueducts transported water directly to farms, ensuring year-round cultivation. Cisterns and reservoirs stored water for dry seasons, acting like ancient backup plans for when the rain didn't come. But that wasn't all. The Romans were also savvy about keeping their soil fertile. They practiced crop rotation, alternating wheat with legumes to keep the land rich in nutrients. Ever wonder how they fertilized their fields? They didn't have fancy chemicals, just good old-fashioned manure and ashes, natural fertilizers that kept the land productive. Their advanced water management and farming techniques were all about sustaining entire cities filled with people. Thanks to their ingenuity, Rome could support huge urban populations without constantly worrying about food shortages. Pretty smart, right? But here's the real question. If the Romans could figure out such an efficient agricultural system over 2,000 years ago, what could we learn from them today? But have you ever wondered how the Romans managed to keep their food fresh without modern refrigeration? When the cold or hot weather hit, they had to get creative. After all, an empire doesn't run on an empty stomach. So, what did they do? They mastered the art of food preservation, ensuring their supplies lasted through harsh winters, naval blockades, and unpredictable supply chain disruptions. One of their go-to methods was salting and drying. Meat and fish were heavily salted to draw out moisture and prevent spoilage. Sounds simple, right? But this technique kept their protein-packed food edible for months. Then came pickling, where vegetables and fruits were soaked in vinegar or brine. Can you even think of crunchy pickled onions or olives adding flavor to an otherwise bland soldier's meal? Smoking was another popular technique, mainly used for meats and fish. Not only did it enhance the taste, but it also made the food last longer, something every traveling legionary appreciated. And of course, let's not forget amphorae storage. These sealed clay jars preserved essentials like oil, wine, and grains, keeping them fresh for extended periods. One of the most intriguing food preservation wonders of ancient Rome was garum, a pungent fermented fish sauce that became a staple across the empire. It was mass-produced in massive factories, particularly in Spain and North Africa. Love it or hate it, garum was Rome's answer to adding flavor to meals, and it was so valued that amphorae filled with it were exported far and wide. Even Pompeii's preserved kitchens give us a glimpse into how Romans stored their food. Amphorae lined up neatly, packed with wine and olive oil, ensuring a steady supply for the household. Without these ingenious techniques, Rome might not have been able to sustain its massive population or its ambitious military campaigns. But have you ever wondered what happened when food ran out in ancient Rome? How did they survive brutal sieges and devastating famines? The Romans were nothing if not resourceful, and their methods of coping with food shortages were both clever and, at times, downright desperate. To prepare for tough times, cities stockpiled food in granaries and collected water in massive cisterns. When under siege, strict rationing was put in place. Naturally, the soldiers and elites got priority, while the common folk had to make do with whatever scraps remained. But what happened when the food truly ran out? Well, things got ugly. In extreme cases, Romans turned to eating acorns, roots, and even dogs. Imagine that. One day you're feasting on bread and cheese, and the next, you're boiling leather just to get something in your stomach. Cassius Dio, a Roman historian, even recorded stories of people resorting to eating leather and boiled grass during prolonged sieges. And let's not forget the strategy of controlled looting. Romans weren't just trying to survive, they were actively stealing food from their enemies whenever possible. A famous example comes from the siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD, where the Roman general Titus cut off all food supplies to the city. The result? Absolute starvation among the defenders, leading to their inevitable surrender. At the end of the day, the Romans understood a brutal truth. Wars weren't always won on the battlefield. Sometimes, the best way to conquer an enemy was simply to outlast their stomachs. It's clear the Romans excelled far beyond building and battle. They had a serious talent for food logistics, too. With massive granaries and smart transportation systems, they made sure both civilians and soldiers stayed fed, no matter the situation. But this was about more than just meals. These systems were a key part of Rome's power. A well-fed population kept society stable, and a well-fed army kept winning wars. Without that level of planning and control, would the Roman Empire have lasted as long as it did?